Hey, what's up, everybody? I've got a very important video and just topic to discuss today, and the title is not clickbait, but rather I'm hoping that this starts a discussion rather than this being a tutorial. And really, the topic of the video is why bass music can or is so difficult to make. I think that being a music producer in general kind of calls for you having to wear so many hats. You need to, do sound design. You need to be better at arrangement and composition. There's an aspect of mixing and mastering. There is an aspect of technicality with being familiar with in some cases, programming and audio engineering. And the more that you get into the intricacies and the nuance rather of more complicated music like bass music, which can span from dubstep to neuro to electronic to whatever, it doesn't matter. There are a lot more barriers that you have to break down in order to be able to feel like you're doing something successful. At the end of the day, it's really interesting because I just actually had an interview with somebody that goes by the name of Monkey Rascal that makes really cool and technical music. And something that him and I both vibed on was this aspect of how to make really off time beats and how to make really swanky stuff. And something that we both agreed on was the issue with making hooks or making ideas. And for me, for the past 6 months, I've actually been struggling, and I've made some music, but I've been struggling with this idea strictly because I'm realizing that what I need and what calls for me to make what I want is something that is going to require a different approach. Let me explain. So, in essence, whenever we talk about stuff like this, the idea of coming up with composition and musicality and all that can come from a lot of different places, right? You can sample, you can, write at the piano, you can come up with a lot of different things by happy accidents, and sometimes it's a conglomerate of all these different things. But I really want to talk about the idea of composition and how if you make bass music in a particular style, it you need to have a different approach than how you normally would. So, what exactly I mean by that is some stuff just can't be written at the piano. I think that's the most clear way to say it. And I think that is the harsh truth of understanding why this can be such a for a barrier of entry or high barrier of entry for people that are wanting to make music like this. I think that you don't have to make music with melody. You don't have to make music with harmony and all that other stuff, chords or whatever. I think that it's probably one of the most conducive ways and is one of the most easy ways to create something that feels familiar, right? Because we thrive off of that. But what is it that you cannot write at the piano? What do you describe for something like this? Which, by the way, I'm going to play some other people's music along with my own. This is not meant to, steal their music or to intend copyright infringement. If I get demonetized, that's fine. I don't care. This is more for academic studying, and also to the original creators of both Audica, Rodtech, and Chi, respectively. If you all have any issue with me using this, Skylar or Lizeo, just let me know and I'll take it down. Okay. I just like your music, so I want to showcase it. So the thing that I'm kind of talking about though is that you can't really, this is going to be loud by the way, you can't really come up with something, you know what I mean, from an instrument that is played like this. So, by the way, this has been stretched out and repitched a little bit to kind of try to avoid getting caught by the algorithm. But how do you make something like that? How do you come about that? And what is the approach on what it is that you do? And some people might even think, oh, well, I'm just going to sit down and design basses all day. And sometimes that might not even be the approach. But like I was saying, this isn't really something that you can audiate or something that you can just imagine in your head and come about. There has to be this aspect of discovery and happy accidents that requires a different workflow and a different habitual practice that changes the way that you think about song creation. or track arrangement, I think would be better. I'm realizing that songs are meant to be sung, so I guess a piece or something else of the sort. Likewise, I actually have not talked to Lisejo about this, which I do want to have a conversation about it if I get another chance to talk to him. But listen to this track, it's a very similar track, but coming up with something like this requires, like, yeah, you don't, I'm not sure what was going through his head whenever he made something like this. Relentless. I love that song. And so, what's really cool about both of these is that they paint a high, or they highlight this idea of texture. They do have a fundamental, they do have things that are very clear and concise. You know, you can tell that somebody's going, "Boo," but the phrasing and the way that you come up with call and response and how you come about those textures and then apply those textures in a song is kind of the contrast that I'm trying to paint here. Likewise, you know, if you have something that you can write at a piano, then you can be super successful, and maybe that's the way that you come up with traditional means of music. Um, I'll talk about this later, but this is like one of my like kind of like lo-fi boom bappy tracks. It's very contrasted in comparison to what I'm about to play, but you can clearly play this on a piano, provided that you have, you know, some kind of ear training or that you know some, you know, basic jazz chords. And so the vibe of this and the way that you come about that seems a lot more straightforward of being able to use that and make it as simple as just here are some chords and here is, you know, something that, you know, provides context to being able to just create something that is less stressful, I would say, at least in my experience. I think that a lot of people can achieve something like this just straight up from sampling or just from using some kind of chord generator and stuff. I'm not going to tell you how I came up with this musical idea. I did come up with it myself, but it wasn't through the means of traditional piano, but it's going to allude to this, just this entire point that I'm trying to create. So the next thing is doing some kind of remix or doing some kind of thing where you either sample or you create an idea based off of somebody else's piece of work. And perhaps the golden approach to this is being able to utilize catalysts to do both. For example, this track is a remix that I did from Cage, and it's, you'll notice that there's some stuff in here that you could definitely write on a piano, but there's also some stuff in here that you most likely cannot. So with the main riff, you can hear that while I have texture in this, and while there are things that kind of match in the in-between, there is both a complementary of melody, but there's also this aspect of utilizing this texture in order to try to create this contrast. It also really helps that Cage designs really distorted sounds in order for me to kind of be able to use something like that. And getting to an aesthetic is a whole different conversation that maybe I'll talk about in a different video. But further down the track, you'll hear that a lot of stuff in here, again, kind of falls into that line of having to go for texture. So now, the thing is that even though there's the melody of do 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 do, you'll hear that the majority of this, the in between and the, I guess again the nuance of this stuff is really focused on texture and focused on trying to utilize that. This is one of my favorite songs that I've ever written because I think that it does a nice job of complementing the musicality with the texture. And perhaps for a lot of people, this would be an ideal kind of track in their own style, of course, to be able to mix. But what I think about whenever I'm doing this kind of stuff is just realizing that in order to start a track or something, you kind of have to pick one or the other. There's some other use cases that I have that are really interesting, but I think that I'm kind of painting the picture when it comes into saying, hey, you kind of have to reframe the way that you think about stuff when trying to make stuff that is geared towards the genre that you want to do. For example, a lot of drum and bass, again, cannot be, written at the piano. I do believe that the middle ground for this is something that I've talked about in other videos, which is the idea of placement. But it's very difficult to try to imagine a song or put sounds together that you might not have ever heard before, if that makes sense. And the cultivation aspect of that comes into, for one, obviously trial and error, but two, understanding that when you make sounds and understanding that when you make something that's like texture, it's meant to replace an instrument. It's meant to replace something that has to be just as fulfilling as a melody, something that's just as fulfilling as a chord progression and stuff. And that is something that I believe makes this 10 times harder because if you are just doing texture, then your sounds have to be so convincing and so compelling and so interesting that makes up for something that could be just a simple catchy melody like what we hear within pop music. And to me, this stuff is really fascinating because it's definitely like overthinking the music making process in general, but because I've dedicated, a third of my life towards making heavy music and trying to understand what makes this work, I find that as much as I know technically, both from a musicality standpoint and from a sound design standpoint, um, it's still a mystery. It's still something that everybody that I know struggles with. And I think that kind of just bringing some of this stuff to light can kind of help guide you with how you might want to look at getting closer towards the genres that you want to make. And I wish that somebody would have told me this whenever I first started, because I was always wanting to make these really heavy tracks and stuff and not really have to focus so much on, or at least not every track, focus so much on, thinking about something via a piano or thinking about a guitar or anything. But the fact of the matter is that it almost feels obvious when you bring it up. If you grow up playing guitar, then you're going to think about music from the perspective of a guitar player. When you play piano, the same thing. If you're a drummer, you're going to think about stuff in terms of rhythm. And I'm curious to the people that, are able to make music like this, they probably don't even think about it this deeply, but I am curious as to, what conversations they're having with themselves whenever they do create this kind of stuff. Cage and I have talked about that in the past, and he's got a unique perspective on that as well. But everyone is unique, and that's something that really brings me joy to be able to talk to people like that. That being said, I think that the overarching thing is that none of this is right or wrong, and that's the most important thing. But I do think that for people that are trying to figure themselves out within music production and music creation and stuff, the reason why bass music is so hard is because it is very elusive and there is generally a high like barrier to entry when trying to be able to pull stuff off. Well, I guess, in certain cases, if you want to make sounds like what we played at the beginning, nobody figures that out immediately. Likewise, if you're all about the yomp music, just the bwop bwop, some people just figure that out immediately and they just get it. And hats off to those people. I have nothing but respect for them. But I was not one of those people. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is when you are thinking about this kind of stuff, and this is only purely for reflective. So, consider it, think about it, and then let it go, because this can drag you into a rabbit hole that you probably don't want to be in the first place. But understand that just because you need to change your approach doesn't mean that you can't source. We're just going to use texture from musical elements. And also, it doesn't mean that you can't source musical elements from texture. If you recall the one of the more recent videos that I did, which is how to, I think it was like audio alchemy or something, and it was pretty much just this idea about how to turn any sound into any kind of sound. So if you have something that is as simple as white noise and you use multiple peaks and dips, you can actually create a chord with an EQ that sounds musical. If you have the right kind of processing and the right kind of approach, you can take someone's voice and turn it into a kick or a snare. It's about understanding the relationship behind the two. But in the grand scheme of things, can you use any of this stuff to build something that is a compelling call and response and a compelling phrase, you know? And I think that that's something that I tend to overthink myself, because a lot of times I would want to go in this direction and my brain kind of pulls me into this duality of really heavy swung drums, but I also have a tendency to make really ambient or really chill things, and I have to kind of like try to retrain my brain to go in that heavier direction. And I've gotten there over the years, but it's still nothing like this, and I don't know if anybody else could pull off what these guys did. Um, yeah, because that song is just absolutely cracked. But that being said, I want to talk about some solutions, and aside from the ones that I was telling you about, and also the means of understanding that just because you have a certain approach doesn't mean that you can't modify it, doesn't mean that you need to like throw everything out of the way and then try to, approach something completely different. If you work on the piano, make stuff on the piano, but get really acclimated with distortion and stuff, and like, figure out how to get into the approach of modular synthesis. Not that you need modular gear, but randomizers and LFOs and stuff in order to create the texture and push it in a certain direction that will fit your style. Likewise, if all you do is make blocks and bloops or whatever, figure out how to make that into something somewhat musical or somewhat rhythmic and help fit that style that you want. From a production standpoint and how to make stuff is like super large and big or whatever, I can only tell you what I know. But that leads into the next point that I want to make, which is go find these people and offer to pay them money for lessons, because that is the number one way that you can learn about these approaches. Um, just about every producer that I've talked to, I've offered to pay them for lessons. I've offered them money, and I've offered to support them in their establishment because I'm hungry for knowledge. And I think that it's really important to remember that as much as I know and as much studying and hard work that I've put into, I'm still learning about things, and I'm still learning things about myself. But every time I've had a creative block, my initial goal, or like the thing that helped me get through, was to go do a lesson with somebody. Go, hit up your favorite artist, try to see if they have a Discord or something, and be like, hey, I want to take lessons from you. And this is what you say. You say, I want to know the conversations that you're having with yourself when you're making music. Because while sound design and all that stuff is really important, most of the time they're going to tell you, I don't know, it just happened, or I had a happy accident. But what's more important than that is, how did you lead up to these happy accidents? How did you lead up to, this aspect of like, how the heck did somebody come up with something like this? What kind of decisions are you making through that experimental process? Or, if you really admire something that someone did musical, they might be able to break it down to you in terms of theory. And so it doesn't have to be one or the other. There might be a little bit of in between. But I think that understanding that a certain kind of music takes a certain kind of approach is kind of the theme about this. And once you understand that, it might help push you a little bit more towards the direction that you want to go in with a little bit more clarity. Hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know. This is kind of a hard topic to discuss, and I'm really curious to know what everyone's thoughts are. And I hope that I didn't just spend the last 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or whatever just blabbering. But I really think that this is something that I want to try to explore more with you all and talk about on a deeper level, because for one, it's fascinating, but two, um, I still struggle with making things sound convincing, as much as I know about bass design, as much as I know about drum design, and it's kind of difficult to get over, and I think that it's time to talk about it. So hopefully that was interesting. Sorry, the nails are painted. I have a cousin, and she asked if she could paint my nails, and how could I say no to that? So yeah, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know what you think. I'll see you all later.